Our hotel has Roombas and I love it. Look at our view, isn't it great?
There's someone smoking out there.
What are we doing today, Kirk?
All I know is it's Harry Potter and some other tours.
We're doing 3 tours. Harry Potter, some underground thing, and a night thing. They told us to bring wands on a tour, so that's what I'm doing. So I own like 6 of them. Tour number 1, Harry Potter. Off to the graveyard.
They were standing instead in a dark and overgrown graveyard. The outline of a small church was visible. So, probing into your deepest Harry Potter trivia knowledge, does anyone know which book that actually comes from? Yes, 10 points! That's what she's like. I'm not even going to wait for it. I know this. This is what I come here for. You are very right. 10 points to you, madam. It comes from Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Lord Voldemort returns, and he and Harry have their infamous duel. Now, looking around this afternoon, it may or may not surprise you guys to know this was the graveyard on which that scene was based. You will see we've got lots of Harry Potter signs buried here within this graveyard. We know that Rowling herself spent a lot of time in here when she first came to Edinburgh, and a cafe that she wrote in extensively that we go past later as part of the tour overlooks Greyfriars. So this is what she was looking at basically every day when she was writing. Harry Potter is an entire world. You can't get everything just from your imagination. It's absolutely fine to use a little bit of what's hanging around. Now, some people do get very caught up on the fact that this graveyard inspired that scene, but it wasn't filmed here. Now, it's not that filming doesn't happen in Edinburgh, it does. Some of you, if you're big on sort of Netflix or Noticed One Day, the series that's come out recently, that was filmed in Edinburgh. It's just quite difficult because Edinburgh is a small city to begin with, and if you want to do filming here you have to shut down quite a lot of it, and we seem to perpetually be closed for tram works most of the time these days, so that's quite difficult to do. You can see we are standing at the grave of Tom Riddle, and as avid Harry Potter fans you will know that this is the real name of our evil Lord Voldemort in Harry Potter. Now some of you, if you're beady-eyed, grammar-conscious people like me, may have noticed that the spelling of Riddle is ever so slightly different, and you might be going, why? What's happening? There's a couple of things. One is that in the time when Tom Riddle was around in the early 1800s, the way you said Riddle was more like Riddell. That is reflected in the spelling. Fine. Boring, but fine. Secondly, more importantly, spelled the way it is, that anagram that we have in the Chamber of Secrets, I am Lord Voldemort, Tom Marvolo Riddle, currently doesn't work. She's a busy woman, we've got a lot of books to write, we don't have time to be caught up on this kind of technicality. So, we take off the second L, E-L the other way around, problem solved. When J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter, she didn't think it was going to be famous. So she wrote the book, she wrote the anagram, and it worked in English. But then it gets translated into 79 different languages. And in order to make the whole I am thing work, many languages had to adapt the name, particularly the middle name. So for example, in French, his middle name is Elvis, which I really enjoy. My favourite has got to be Chinese, purely because of the obstacle that it represents, because Chinese as a language doesn't have the Roman alphabet. It's not possible to make anagrams in Chinese, which represents a bit of a problem when it's kind of integral to your plot. So what they had to do was, it kind of sounds like I am Lord Voldemort, Tom Marvolo Riddle, but then they have a little asterisk and they just take a break and spend half a page explaining what anagrams are. Now if you have read, seen or just heard about Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, you will remember powdered bone is required from the grave of Voldemort's father to bring him back to life. Also Tom Riddle, and here we have father and son, both Tom Riddle. You just saw with Riddle, Tom Riddle and the real Tom Riddle, the resemblance again is just the name behind the character Professor McGonagall. Now that is pretty cool, because William McGonagall wasn't a teacher, so he definitely wasn't a deputy headmistress. He was more like Rowling. He was a writer. But he didn't write novels, he wrote poetry. But not just any poetry, really awful poetry. He actually received an unofficial after-death title as the world's worst poet. So people tend to go, okay, probably not a very popular guy. But here in Scotland, we just love to celebrate failure. And so he was invited all over the country, and he would stand and recite his terrible poetry. And looking back, Edinburgh had actually labelled him as being one of the very earliest forms of stand-up comedians. But we're zooming into the castle from the outside. It's usually covered in snow, looking fabulous. That is pretty much what she had in mind. She did also do a lot of sketching, like early sketching, for a lot of the Harry Potter scenery before the films were made. And you can look at some of these online, and you can see her early sketches do look a lot like George Herriot's in that She designed it initially as almost like a quadrangle, and each one of these big turrets on the corner would have been one of the house dormitories. Now, when Warner Brothers took it on, they turned it into more like general sprawling castle. And I think you'll agree, it is still very castle-like in its architecture, which was designed by a guy called William Wallace. No, not Mel Gibson in a kilt in Braveheart. Different William Wallace, don't confuse the two. Originally, it was actually a hospital, but very quickly they turned it into a school for what the Scots call poor wee fatherless bairns, i.e. poor orphaned children. And now, as you can see, nearly 400 years later, it is still a functioning school, but it is now a private school. And you rightly pointed out, one of the most expensive private schools in all of Scotland. What I want you to imagine is you're sat on a little stool in George Heriot's with hundreds of people watching you. And then what I'm going to do is read you the names of the George Heriot houses. They're not the Hogwarts houses, but they have the same house colours. One of them, you'll just like the sound of it. It will just appeal to you somehow. And then what I'll do is you'll pick which one you like, and then I'll read you what house colours are, and it will match you up with a corresponding Hogwarts house. At George Heriot's, we have got Lauriston, Castle, Rayburn, or Greyfriars. As I say, these houses do not sound the same. It's all about the house colours. Lauriston is green, like Slytherin. Castle, blue, like Ravenclaw for all the swotty clever nerds, like me. Rayburn, red, like Gryffindor for all the brave, strong children. And Greyfriars is a creamy yellow colour, like Hufflepuff for all the other children. We like to joke in the book because that's what they do in the book. We like to joke on the tour. We are going to go past a cafe called the Elephant House. It has got a big ostentatious sign above the door saying birthplace of Harry Potter. Please note, birthplace in quotation marks. Not because it is a quote, because it is not actually true. Because to me, birthplace as a series means that the first book was written there, which it wasn't. As I told you earlier, it was written at the Nicholson Cafe. And the Elephant House didn't open until 1997. She's already written the first book by that point, so it's not very likely. But, as I said, the Nicholson Cafe closed down. There wasn't really anyone else around to take the credit. And she was pictured right in there at several points by, one point by like a TV documentary, and other points just by various newspapers that just sort of like followed her around. So she was pictured writing in there a lot, and some of it, Bright Spark at some point was like, wow, you guys are basically the birthplace of Harry Potter. And they were like, that sounds like great marketing, thank you very much. Realistically, there are several cafes that are associated with her. Some lean into that more or less than others, but the Elephant House is kind of what's been known as like the epicenter. And it was also one of her favourite places. Now, it is also important because remember at the start of the tour, I was talking about the importance of the graveyard and things. So it's from the Elephant House, from her favourite room at the back next to the window, where you have this direct view of Greyfriars Kirkyard. So she wasn't writing in there. She would have had the view of the graveyard and of the school, and maybe some of the scenery would have looked a bit different. Now, the original Elephant House at the moment isn't open because the neighbouring building had a bad fire, and there was some smoke and water damage obtained in the Elephant House. It's not been able to reopen just yet. So what they've done is they've set up like a sister cafe on Victoria Street, which is where we finished the tour actually. When you would go into the Elephant House, the whole point of going into it is that they preserved it basically exactly the way it was when J.K. Rowling wrote there. So there's a poster that has like a picture of her writing at her favourite table, but everything else about the cafe was just, this is how it looked when she was here. You're seeing what she was seeing when she was writing. Okay guys, well done, you've made it to the last stop on the tour. Your feet are aching, but you've done it. So this is Diagon Alley. Now, just as I said earlier that there's no one place that can say this is Hogwarts, the same is true for Diagon Alley. It's several streets that are inspirational. So there's this street, Victoria Street, Coburn Street, and we're all just connected to the Royal Mile, and several streets in London, as well as Gatsby Street in Exeter, where Rowling went to university. Now, we can't go to all of them. So we come in this beautiful bite-sized piece of Diagon Alley with its beautiful multicoloured buildings with cobbled paths. Many of the shops on here as well are basically the same as those in Diagon Alley. We're standing just outside John Kay's. It sells like books and maps. It's very similar to Flourish and Blotts, where students would go for school supplies. Further down the way is a whiskey tavern who make their own whiskey. They do make their own brand of one, which I tried 5 years ago and still tastes. A little bit further around the corner, just out of sight, we had a jokes and magic shop, very similar to the Weasley's Wizarding Weasleys, run by the Weasley twins. For 130 years on this street as well, you could purchase a broomstick. There was a brushes and broomstick shop down here, which closed down in 2007 when presumably people realised that yes, broomsticks are very quaint, but a Dyson really does do a better job. So looking at the different colours as you go down, where that orange one is, which is just on the curb, that's where that shop was. It is now Museum Town Context, a dedicated Harry Potter souvenir shop. People often ask on the tour where they can go to get Harry Potter gifts. Realistically, there's several places in Edinburgh, but I like this place best because the people who run it are absolutely lovely, and the shop itself looks like it's been sucked straight out of Diagon Alley. It's a really cute interior. We're also very close to Edinburgh Castle. It's basically behind these buildings here at the top of the Royal Mile. When Harry Potter came out, a lot of people said Edinburgh Castle, Hogwarts, are the two connected? Now you know me, I love documentation, and I've never seen anything official that says the two are related. Think about it. It's a castle in the middle of the city she lives in, the city she loves. It used to be above the Nor Loch, just like Hogwarts is right above the Great Black Lake. And remember, the Nor Loch, where they did the witch trials, dirty, sewagey, probably looked like a black lake, I would imagine. So I don't know if there was any connection in the beginning. What I do know is that Edinburgh Castle became Hogwarts for one incredible night. Now, after the release of the Half-Blood print, Rowling agreed to do a rare publicity stunt. Now, she doesn't do a lot of these, but she did agree to this stunt, and that invited 60 school children from all across Scotland to come to Edinburgh Castle. And the entire thing was decorated from top to toe as if it was Hogwarts. I'm not even joking, horses dressed as thestrals. So some of us, if we are of a certain age, not me because I've been 21 for the past 11 years, but some people may remember midnight releases where like bookstores or cinemas would stay open or open rather at midnight. Exactly. First showings of the film, copies of the books would go on sale at midnight. It was a big thing. J.K. Rowling rocked out at midnight behind a hidden secret door behind a tapestry, sat down, read the first chapter of the book to the children, and they all took away personalised, signed copies. What the hell?
Yeah.
Did these children have to do?
Literally.
I'm like, was there a lottery? Was there a competition? Did someone lose a kidney? I just want to know. So guys, that is us at the end of the tour, but I think we all know it's not really the end of a school year at Hogwarts if I don't spontaneously award 300 points to Gryffindor.
Yeah.
I'm always panicking.
Cheese, 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 cheese. Tour 2. We're going into the underground.
So zoomed in.
No, it's not. That's zoomed in.
Now, back in the 14th century, the front of St Giles Cathedral, this area here was the graveyard of St Giles Cathedral. Now, it's a pretty sizable graveyard, so the entire front of the St Giles where the pipe band was, this entire building here and also right in front of us. But unfortunately, the graveyard did fill up very quickly, and by 1567, a lot of reports say there was only about 3 inches of soil covering the bodies that were buried here by this point. And for many reasons, that's very unpleasant. You get the picture, it wasn't very nice. Now, Mary Queen of Scots had to give the official order for the graveyard to be moved, and this was done by the top 6 foot of bodies being moved to a mass grave outside the city walls. The ones that are further into the ground from the 1300s and the 1400s, a lot of them are actually still in this ground to this day, resting in peace as they should do, but you probably noticed there's no headstones or gravestones or anything like that. Many of them have been swapped, broken, and no one actually took note of whose grave was whose. So the easiest thing to do at the time was just cover up the graveyard, use the space for something else. Now at the front of St Giles, they decided that was going to be a great place to build Edinburgh's first debtors' prison. So the toll booth prison was built out the front there. It was torn down in 1817, so there's nothing to look at anymore. But it was quite a long, thin building, about 8 or 9 stories high, which was quite impressive for the 1560s. In the couple hundred years that it did stand there, it did eventually progress from a debtors' prison to an all-round prison. So you had debtors, you had pickpockets, murderers, everyone else in between, all in their holding cells as they awaited trial. Now, if you were found guilty for whatever crime you'd been arrested for, was usually pretty likely. You had a very short walk from the toll booth to the gallows. Now, the gallows stood, you can just about spy the wee building where the gallows stood with the little French flags over there, outside the front of St Giles as well. Now, there was a couple sets of gallows in Edinburgh around this time period, one in the Grass Market and also one right there. Now, that one was built on a much higher platform, and all the big high-profile cases were punished right there, and it meant everyone who was coming out to see a public hanging for their entertainment had a better view. Because yes, that was entertainment back in the day. Now, if you had younger kids, weaker stomach, you just didn't like a public hanging, it's not everyone's cup of tea, I suppose, you could instead head to the Mercat Cross, and that's where the petty criminals were punished. Now, these wee streets, and the close part of the name that they have in common, comes from a couple different reasons. The buildings themselves were built very close together at one point, and also the streets themselves pre-1800s Edinburgh were closed in the evening. So there was a gate at the top of the street, a gate down at the bottom of the street. 10 p.m. every night, the town guards, who were essentially the police at this point, came along and locked those gates. Now, in theory, that was to keep you nice and safe. If you had a front door on a street like this, you weren't going to get robbed overnight. Extra security for yourself. Also, it was exercising some control of the people of Edinburgh. You had a curfew, you had to go to your bed, behave yourself, that kind of thing. Now, over the years, a lot of the closes haven't changed a huge amount. Many of them are still narrow, dark little streets. This one's a little bit of an exception, as you can see. It's nice and bright down the bottom half. That's because there was a fire that broke out in this close in the 1840s, burnt down the buildings that stood either side, that created a very narrow little street, and they just didn't rebuild it in the same fashion. But many of them still had their same rough structure, narrow, dark little alleyways. Now, the one major difference that the closes have, and Edinburgh's Old Town in general has, is much cleaner than it used to be. Because the buildings that now make up the Old Town all have plumbing inside, and we're very big fans of the plumbing. But the buildings that now make up the Edinburgh's Old Town are from the 1860s. They've all got toilets, great, fantastic. The buildings that once made up the Old Town were wooden structures, very unsafe, very flammable, also in this closest case. No toilets. So if you needed the bathroom, you used a bucket. Said bucket was filled up throughout the day as different people used it. It's also the household waste bin, and at some point that bucket would need to be emptied. Now, if you live on the ground floor, it's a nice easy job. You just open your front door and tip out onto the street, not harming too many people. If you lived above ground floor, which is where most people lived and also worked, the easiest thing for you to do is to go to your window. Open up your window, shout "Guardy Loo" as your warning to people walking below, and then tip that bucket of filth right out onto the street. Now, if you happen to be walking by at this point, clearly you don't want something dumped on your head. So if you hear someone shouting "Guardy Loo," you've got a couple options. If you can run pretty fast, run out the way, absolutely. Or shout back something like hold your hand, and hopefully they heard you in enough time. Realistically though, the person whose job it was to empty that bucket of waste was usually the youngest member of the family, because it was the worst job in the household, so of course the youngest had to do it. And if that kid's 7, 8 years old and living on one of the higher floors of the old buildings, some of them were about 14 stories high back in the day, there's very little chance you'd be able to hear that wee voice above the crowds and the hustle and bustle of the street below. So everyone had to have very quick reflexes, jumping out the way if you needed to. Everyone had a head covering on as well. It wasn't just the fashion, it was very much a practicality thing for people of Edinburgh. The stuff that missed you, great, you're now having a good day, nothing's in your hair, but you now get to walk along it and through all that unmentionable things. There's a good couple inches of you-know-what everywhere in Edinburgh's Old Town. It was very often just compacted, smelly, and of course everyone kind of smelled anyway, so all mixed together. It rains pretty frequently in Scotland, so often it did kind of rinse away, but never entirely. And if you're on a street like this one, the filth starts running down this hill, you get to walk through it still, but it doesn't just evaporate, it just lands down at the bottom of the street. Now, once upon a time before this street was rebuilt, there was a very clean shot to a road called the Cowgate. And the Cowgate runs along the bottom of many of the closes on the south of the mile. So unfortunately for the Cowgate, all the filth that was building up in these closes, running down the hill, ended up in that road instead. Now, the Cowgate gets its name because cows were brought along that street to go to market and other animals. So not only did you have the human waste building up down there, you then got the animal waste on top of it. By the mid-1700s, the filth had got so bad in the Cowgate, it was easily up to your knees at some point. Absolutely disgusting, filthy, no one wanted to walk through it, obviously. We are going to walk along part of the Cowgate in just a little second. Don't worry, much cleaner than it used to be. It smells more like beer than anything else when it comes down. So this is what Southbridge looks like. If someone cuts it open, we can see what's going on in the inside. So just this, well actually all 3 levels are the exact same, so do feel free to look at any of the levels here. Now when I pointed out Southbridge and we were standing outside, you could see there was a Marie Curie charity shop, subway, and there's some buses going past. Now the Marie Curie and the subway are in this building just here, and some buses were heading across this direction. You're now officially inside of Southbridge. I'm sure you'd all agree with me in saying people shouldn't be living inside of a bridge, no matter what class they are. But unfortunately people were living inside the bridge and in, well, this vault specifically and other ones as well that we'll venture into. Puddles under your feet, as you've probably already discovered. The reason for that, lovely soggy limestone ceiling above your heads. Very mouldy, as you can see. Now the mould is completely harmless. I haven't brought you into some weird like Last of Us situation. Why were people living down here? Obviously this is, well, very much their last resort, but a lot of them are kind of forced into this situation as well. Now, a lot of Irish people arriving here during the famine, and they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms into Edinburgh. Many of them were facing quite bad discrimination. Either they couldn't find work or they couldn't find work that paid well enough. And if you've got a family to feed, you need money. So a lot of them had to resort to begging for their money. Now, a lot of these people were not bad people. They didn't deserve to lose their lives just because they were down on their luck and in poverty. So they needed somewhere to go, specifically at night when the town guard weren't venturing, which is why they ended up in these vaults. Now, it was never the case you had a room to yourself and your family. It was yourself and your family, 20 to 30 strangers. All different ages, all different health issues, and no one's using a bucket for their waste down here. There is no furniture, so you're sleeping in the waste. There's also a vault above our heads here. You're doing the exact same thing upstairs, and the ceiling leaks. So if you happened to sleep with your mouth open back in the day and you're living down here, you can imagine how ill these people got. As soon as one person had something contagious, it's just spread. There's no way to contain it. Now, unfortunately, we'll never have an accurate number of how many people lived and died down here, because no one was coming down here and checking up on these people. We can estimate it in the thousands, from about 1,000 to 1,500, from the amount of people coming into Edinburgh around this time period, and then their deaths being registered quickly afterwards, if their deaths were registered in the first place. There's a lot of people who kind of just disappeared. The number we could be sort of conservatively estimating could be far higher. It is depressing, it's horrible, no one should have had to go through this situation. We're going to change subjects for a little second. I'm going to tell you about the vault next door. Quite a few of you spotted it as we walked past. It's very intriguing. Let's go have a wee chat about it now, shall we? Gold star for witchcraft. Yes, exactly. What we're looking at here is a modern day witches' temple. It was used by the source coven of the Blue Dragon from 1996 till 2014. So very recently. Luckily for us, this coven of witches were a good coven of witches. They were not summoning Satan from the other side. No demons have ever popped in to say hello. The star, you've seen a lot of their belongings in there. It's obviously a 5-pointed star, but it's not a pentagram star. Now the pentacle itself represents the 4 elements and spirits. Now this coven's belief systems were very much rooted in pagan and druid beliefs. So a lot of their information and their influences. Now they discovered us in '96 by coming on a tour, much like you have. They were curious about what was going on down here. Now you can put that down to the fact that Edinburgh's an old, weird, spooky place anyway, or a lot of people lived and died down here, and there could be a few lingering spirits if you choose to believe in that kind of thing. Either way, they knew they really wanted one of these vaults as their temple. Now clearly they were successful in getting one. While they were in active coven and working in this room, they were doing quite nice stuff. Tarot card readings, hand fasting ceremonies. They actually performed the first legal Wiccan wedding in Scotland inside of this vault right here. Not my personal choice of a wedding venue, you know, each their own at the end of the day. Now in 2014 they did go their separate directions and the coven actually disbanded entirely. That's because their high priest passed away that year. His name was George Cameron. Now, it's nothing untoward about his passing. He was just an older gentleman, it was his time. But the coven didn't feel right having someone else in that role. So they decided the best thing for everyone, go their separate directions. The request to us at this point was we keep the vault exactly as is. No one touches anything, no one goes inside, and we're really trying to keep that promise to them as much as we possibly can. So we don't take tour groups in there. I have never been in here myself. We don't just go wandering in. This isn't actually their first choice of vault. The one they chose first is further up the corridor, and they only lasted 2 months inside of that vault. After they left, not a single member of the coven ever set foot inside of it ever again. They absolutely refused to do so. I'm going to take you to that vault now. Alright, so this is the vault that the coven initially chose when they moved down here. Now, they were given a couple of options, but they were drawn to this one for some reason. So they went with that impulse to move themselves in. Now, while they were working in here, it looked almost identical to the room we've just been looking at. There was 2 differences. There used to be a mirror that hung where those candles are on the back wall there, and the stone circle that is in front of us. Now, the coven put the stone circle here. We didn't discover the vaults like this. That would have been really creepy. Coven witches will use a circle of a natural substance to protect themselves when they practice. Salts could be used, chalk, stone. Now they use chalk in their other vault, they use stone in here, because these stones were already in this room, so they put them to good use. Now initially, they were very comfortable. They came and went as they pleased, they performed the rituals, but pretty early on, odd things started to happen. So when stuff ended up in places they shouldn't be, things falling over on their own, candles going out on their own, they could handle that. That was okay. They were fully aware they were maybe not alone down here. But into the second month that they spent in here, things began to escalate. The first major thing was if they spent too long practicing in here, they had this overwhelming feeling they were going to be violently sick. That feeling would be gone as soon as they stepped over the threshold. Now, this wasn't happening to just one person, one random time. This was happening to an entire room of people on a frequent basis. The main complaint, the final, last straw, something was physically harming them. They were ending up with deep scratches down their backs and the backs of their necks. They had no idea how these scratches were ending up on their bodies, but honestly, they were pretty terrified. They went to George, they expressed their concerns, and he agreed with them. The best thing to do is to move vault. But before they did that, he felt he had a responsibility to at least try and figure out what was going on. So one evening, he came down on his own. Sat himself in the middle of this circle with a candle, a sleeping bag, and his book of rituals. For the first few hours he spends sort of calling out, hoping to make a connection with something. Round about 3:30 in the morning, he's thinking, ugh, nothing's going to happen. Still, he stood up, he shouted, "Whoever it is, show yourself!" No one responded to him. He thought, well, someone's managed to break in off the street, not exactly ideal, I better go chuck them out. So he's about to leave the circle, step over the stone just at the edge there, and a thought crosses his mind. What if this is a trick? So he takes a couple steps back and stays where he knows he's safe. Now, the mirror that I mentioned that hung on that wall, it fell to the ground and shattered. Naturally, it gives George quite a fright, so he runs towards the door again. Now, George said something was blocking the exit, something that he felt meant to cause him harm. So again, he stayed inside the circle, but this thing, whatever it was, began to circle him. Slowly at first. He's calling out to him, asking what it was. Why is he here? He can't get a response. The only thing that is changing is it's getting faster. And George is starting to panic by this point. Because quite frankly, he'd like to go home. But he doesn't know if he can get out of this room without getting hurt. At that moment, the thing, whatever it is, ends up on the ceiling right above his head. Now George takes the opportunity, runs out of his room as fast as he can. George begs him to break up the entrance to this vault and not let anyone in here ever again. Now, I haven't brought you in here to put you in harm's way, I promise. We quite like weird spooky stuff. Might have got onto that fact, and we quite like telling people about it as well. So it seemed counterproductive to us to close the vault with the weird things going on. So we asked George, look, is there a way we can keep the vault open but keep people safe? He said the stone circle has to stay in that case. The Coven's final act in this room was to change how it works. So instead of protecting the person standing inside of it as it once did, it now traps something inside of it. Now, 9 out of 10 people who step in this stone circle are absolutely fine, nothing happens to them. 1 out of 10 will projectile vomit or pass out. We had one gentleman step into the stone circle and have a heart attack. Who's first?
Fine, I'll go first.
Go?
Yeah. I'm good.
Yeah.
I think I'm 5.
Yeah, good. That's what I'm the one who has to clean up this.
Oh, okay.
I know. I feel like some people always step in there and hope they're going to fall through time.
My job to kind of show you the darker side of Edinburgh. Now it's a little bit different, this tour, than say the daytime tours you may have been on already. Those ones are all about the castle and the nice people that have lived here. This one is actually all about the murderers and the vampires, the cannibals and the serial killers as well. Okay, so it is quite dark, but it really is good, alright? First story I want to tell you, I need you to actually kind of try and imagine, if you can, that the year is 1645, 400 years ago. And I know it's maybe hard to imagine, because 400 years ago is really a long time, but Edinburgh is one of the easiest places to imagine the past, because all you have to do really is look around you. Okay, for example, you see this church that kind of stands just up there with a tower on it. That this year they're having a birthday. It's 900 years old. So in 1645 it was already there for a very, very long time. This church here with the clock tower, the Tronkirk here, this one's quite new. It's about 475 years old. So new for the time, but very, very old to us. But the Starbucks next door, you can delete that from your imagination. Okay, but everything else was pretty much the same. And the boils would grow on your body in all these places, and that's the size they could get to, like a ball in your hand, before they would burst and pus and blood would start spraying across the street. Now it was the third wave of the bubonic plague as it swept through Edinburgh, and in the space of only 18 months, just a year and a half, they managed to kill about 7,000 people with this disease. It was really horrible, and if you or your family kind of caught the disease, you would want to stop the spread as soon as possible. So what you would do is go hide inside your flat, kind of these buildings along the Royal Mile, and you'd be up there in your flat with 20 members of your family, because the families were huge back then, and you'd be up there for about 2 weeks until a man called Dr. Ray would come and knock on your door. He was the plague doctor in Edinburgh. He wore one of those big long wooden masks on his nose to kind of protect him from inhaling kind of the disease. That's how they felt it was spread anyway. It wasn't actually done that way, but it was meant to protect him. And when he knocked on your door, he was looking to see, is anybody going to answer your door? And if somebody did, that meant it was quite good news. At least one person in your family was still alive. When you had all these people dying, thousands of them over just a few months, and then you had dozens of people dying every day, and to get rid of the dead bodies, what you would do is pile them on top of wooden carts where we're standing right now, and it's on this street, and at the end of the day, this pile of bodies, you start driving it that way down to Arthur's Seat, you know, a national park you may have seen, with a big hill down at the bottom of Edinburgh, down at the bottom of the Royal Mile. But when you got down there were actually fire pits that had been dug into the side of the hill, and that's where they threw all these bodies on top to burn the disease, to get rid of it. But if you were on top of this pile of dead bodies, what you'd be really hoping for is that actually you were already dead. But actually what often would happen is the doctor felt like, although you're not quite dead yet, you might not make it through the next day. So actually it's maybe easier just to get rid of you now. So when you were on top of this pile of dead bodies, sometimes what you were doing is keeping your fingers crossed and praying that you were dead before you got to the flames, because every single person is getting thrown on top of there, which is why the sound of Edinburgh back then was the sound of people screaming as they burned alive on the flames, and the smell of the city was actually the smell of roasting human flesh, which some people say smells like barbecued pork. So if you kind of try and imagine what that would smell like and sound like, well, that's what Edinburgh was like 400 years ago, okay? So that story is just like a beginner's version of the dark side of Edinburgh, okay? It's like a children's story, just to whet your appetite, make sure you're on the right tour. But like I say, it does get quite dark, okay? It's all about the really bad people and the bad things that have happened. So, the writer of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, she actually wrote the last Harry Potter book inside that hotel in room number 522, and that room now is called the J.K. Rowling Suite, and it actually costs £4,600 for one night to stay inside that suite now. But if you are a Harry Potter fan, which I imagine some people might be, you can actually pay an extra £100 per night to sleep in the same bed sheets that J.K. Rowling slept in, okay, which is possibly the darkest part of the tour. There was something very special going on in this graveyard 200 years ago in a year 1828. So almost now 2 centuries is coming up to the anniversary. But in the year 1828, inside the city centre, there actually was a doctor called Dr. Robert Knox that worked for Edinburgh University. And he was really famous for kind of being the head of the medical school. And what he would do at the end of the day, when the students had all gone home, he'd finished off his paperwork, before he went home to his bed, he'd actually stand at the back door of the university in the middle of the night, at about midnight, and he'd be holding £7 and 10 shillings in his hand, and he would give that to anybody that would bring him a fresh dead human being. And very importantly, he'd never ask you where you got this dead body from. That was all part of the deal. It was none of his business. So what he would do is pay people with these fresh dead bodies quite a lot of money. So it then started almost like a criminal kind of underbelly, a society inside Edinburgh, where people would come to this graveyard to steal people's dead bodies. They would actually dig them out of the graves where we are right now. So when you came to this graveyard and you wanted to steal a fresh dead body, you had to make sure you were finding the freshest ones, because the doctor was not going to pay for ones that were decomposing. So you'd be in this graveyard kind of searching around, and when you found one that you felt like was going to be fresh, what you would do is put your shovel into the ground, a bit like this, but before you started the digging part, you'd actually have to wait for a signal, and the signal came from this tower behind me. See the one on my left-hand shoulder? Now these towers are actually part of a prison inside this graveyard called the Old Colton Prison. At night time, people would stand on top of the prison, so members of the public, and they would tell people trying to steal dead bodies that they have to piss off or to get out of the graveyard. This person's family of this dead body has not paid those people to look after them, because they're not there to do it as a public service. They're not being paid by the government. They're doing it to earn extra money. Start digging, you get them out quite quickly because you'd have a team of 3 or 4 or 5 people helping you, and then you'd put the body over your shoulders and walk it back to the doctor across that bridge. It's about maybe 5 to 10 minutes walk. When you got there, the doctor would then look at the dead body, make sure it was fresh, make sure there's no parts missing, and if he felt like maybe it wasn't quite worth the full £7 and 10 shillings, he might offer you only £3 or £4, which is a little bit disappointing, but the only issue was, now you've kind of got this dead body, you kind of just have to accept whatever the doctor says. So whether he offered you 2, 3, 4 or 5, you just had to say yes, because now you've got the dead body, you might as well accept it. So he would buy the dead bodies, and then during the daytime with his students the next day, he would actually dissect the dead bodies. He'd study then the skeleton, the internal organs, and he was one of the world's leading kind of people doing research around human anatomy. So that's why he became very famous, and he was involved in this kind of body trade, and actually he bought around about 1,000 dead bodies in his time over the decade of the 1820s. The 1828, the year I mentioned very specifically, is the most famous kind of year he was involved, because when he stood at the back door of the university waiting for dead bodies, £7, 10 shillings was like the maximum price for most people. We had 2 favourite customers that would always bring him very fresh dead bodies, and they got around about £12, which is almost double, because they were actually bringing warm dead bodies to the doctor, which were as fresh as can be. This story, Alan Menzies, the Vampire of Edinburgh, he used to live in the old town of Edinburgh near the castle. He rented a flat in the old town, quite close to where all the pubs and restaurants are, and when he lived inside there, he truly believed that he was going to become a vampire. And as this 20-year-old young man, he'd walk around all the pubs down there and ask people that were inside the city, do you know any vampires, and basically how can I become one? And it sounds crazy to us because vampire stories and movies and TV shows and books are pretty cool, but we all know they don't really exist. But Alan really believed. So he went around all these people, and it does sound crazy, but he did meet a real-life vampire after only about 1 or 2 weeks of looking, and not only was she a real vampire, she actually fell in love with Alan, and he fell in love with her back, okay? So it does show you there is somebody for everybody, no matter who you are. He fell in love with her, and he said, well, you are a vampire, how do I become one just like you? She said, it's simple, there's 2 steps. Step 1, go down to the local butcher, buy a pig's heart, take it home with you, and then eat it. But you have to eat it raw, you can't cook it, and you have to do this every day for 6 months. So he ended up eating 180 raw pig's hearts day after day after day after day. And when he got to the end of that, he went back to his girlfriend, the vampire, and said, I've done that step, what was the second step? All you have to do is find a human being inside Edinburgh now, and you're going to drain all the blood from their body, and then you're going to drink all of the blood from their body. And that's when Alan replied, that is so easy, you're absolutely right. I know exactly who I'm going to do it to, because he's got one friend inside the city, a young man called Thomas McKendrick, and he invited him round to his flat one night, and he said to Thomas, I'm going to become a vampire tonight, but to do that, I need to drink your blood. What do you think about that? And that is when Thomas said, absolutely no way. I don't think you're going to become a vampire, and I think you could be mentally ill. That's what he said to him. Then he said, your girlfriend that you've told me all about, I don't believe she's a vampire, and I actually am beginning to question whether she exists. I don't actually think she is a real person. And that was his fatal mistake, because when he said that to Alan, he actually took revenge by flying into a fit of rage, and he ended up murdering Thomas McKendrick. And the way he did it is he basically hit him round the head 12 times with a blunt kind of ornament from his sideboard. He also got a knife and stabbed Thomas 40 times to drain his blood, and then used that knife to carve in a circle from his chin all the way around his face back towards his chin, so then he could peel the skin off his face. I then put it in a frying pan and cooked and ate Thomas McKendrick's face. Now, I know what you're all thinking right now. That is a few steps further than the original instructions. He knew if he does it like this, he will become a vampire. Now, that's a very violent and quite evil story, but the scariest part is this all happened in 2003. This happened 21 years ago in the heart of Edinburgh, and Alan Menzies was given a 22-year sentence in prison, which probably makes you think you're never coming back here, guys, because that's next year if you do the quick maths in your head, okay? But Alan, he will not be out next year. Sadly for him, I guess, he committed suicide in prison just 1 year after being found guilty, but otherwise he would have been out next year. But we also did our witch trials inside that lake as well, and when I asked most people around the world where the most famous witch trials are, I'm pretty sure, because a lot of people are here from the States and North America, you're all going to say Salem is the most famous witch trials, and fair enough, it is the most popular in pop culture. You've got like Sabrina the Teenage Witch and all the books, movies and TV shows all about it, but only, and I was surprised to find, only around about 16 people died actually being witches in Salem. I was really shocked by that. I thought it was going to be lots of people, because the witch trials in Edinburgh, the ones that lasted from about 1575 until about 1600, about a quarter of a century, we actually managed to murder about 4,500 women, accusing them of being witches. So we took the Salem trial numbers and then multiplied it by really quite a lot. So we took it to the next level and then even beyond that. And what we would do is kind of try and catch a witch by trying to figure out, based on the rules that this thing laid down. Now the first rule would be, you would actually be a young woman. That was kind of it for young women. It's easy to identify them as one. But the second rule would be, this young woman was very likely to have red or ginger hair. Okay, now I don't know if you see where that problem then lies when you're in Scotland, because quite a lot of people, have this colour hair, and then unfortunately you could be blonde here. What they would do then is they would take a young woman down to the lake down there, tie her to a chair using ropes, and then throw her inside the water, and if she sunk to the bottom, the really great news was she was not a witch, but the bad news was she had now drowned at the bottom of the lake. She was now dead and going to not come back until her body was decomposing and then floated back to the surface. So not very good, but the people that floated along the surface, and it was no fault of their own that happened, they were tied to a chair, they had no say in the matter. If they floated along the surface, it meant clearly they had used their witch's powers to save their own lives, and that meant you could say this person was guilty. So you would take this person out of the water, you go through an actual trial in front of a judge and a jury, but the evidence was all there, she was a witch. It was like 100% conviction rate from that point. We then take this woman, there was 4,500 of them, and we take them up to Calton Hill, where we're standing right now, and along this kind of arch that kind of goes round in this kind of crescent here, with this amazing view of the castle, but then the castle back towards it, you'd have a wooden stakes set up along this arch here, and what you would do is tie this young woman to the wooden stake and then set her on fire. You basically burn her alive, so the royal family, the king inside there, could see it all happening. He now knew that definitely he was going to get rid of all the witches. So it was a really, really horrible thing to do, and it was really obviously very, very nasty.
So they set live music outside. I wonder if there's...
This is a big old piece of
Vegas burger.
You like fish and chips?
Just starting to be, so I'm zero chance of getting the walk. You're learning to feel the language and the pair of use. Marvin's getting all out of the wall. While I'm on the garbage line, running this. I can't even think my board. That's not these stories. I'm like, you're amazing. All these cats are crazy. Well, guys getting their heads cracked down the road. The neighbours getting done for skag. Dana's chucking dishes out the kitchen door. Cause she doesn't have enough for France.
What a day! 3 walking tours and sat down.
I had to pee.
Now we're off to bed because our tour starts tomorrow. Let's go. Bum, 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 bum.